Somewhere above your head right now, a satellite is losing a race it does not even know it is running. On the ground, a handful of quantum machines just quietly did something that should terrify every bank, every government, and every company that thinks its secrets are safe. This is not science fiction anymore. This is happening in 2026 right now, while most people are still arguing about whether quantum computers even matter. Here is the uncomfortable truth nobody wants to say out loud. The entire security system that protects your bank account, your Bitcoin wallet, your government's classified files, and the satellites orbiting our planet was built on one simple assumption. That assumption is that certain math problems are too hard for any computer to solve in a reasonable amount of time. Quantum computers do not care about that assumption anymore. And in the last few weeks, the gap between old technology and new technology has widened so fast that even Wall Street cannot ignore it. Let's start with space, because that is where this story gets genuinely strange. For years, engineers believed you could only send fragile quantum signals in one direction. You could beam entangled particles of light down from a satellite to a ground station, but sending them up from Earth into space was considered close to impossible. The atmosphere scrambles the signal, turbulence destroys the fragile particles, and any noise along the way collapses the entire transmission before it even reaches orbit. That is exactly the kind of problem that engineers spend entire careers trying to solve, and for a long time it looked like a dead end. Then, researchers modeled a way around it. Using a technique called entanglement swapping, along with detailed predictions of atmospheric conditions, satellite positioning, and background noise, scientists showed that sending quantum signals from the ground up into space is actually possible after all. This is not a small technical footnote. This flips one of the biggest assumptions in the entire field of space-based quantum communication. If ground stations can push quantum signals upward instead of only receiving them, then building a genuine quantum internet that spans the globe suddenly becomes a real engineering roadmap instead of a fantasy. Why does this matter to you, sitting wherever you are right now watching this video? Because classical satellites, the ones that carry your phone calls, your bank transactions, your GPS location, and your internet traffic, were never designed for a world where quantum machines exist. Classical encryption works by relying on math, problems that would take a normal computer thousands of years to crack. A sufficiently powerful quantum computer could, in theory, tear through some of that same math in a fraction of the time. That is not a rumor. That is the exact reason why governments around the world have started racing to rebuild the encryption running through their most sensitive systems before quantum machines get powerful enough to break it. This is exactly why you are now seeing headlines about post-quantum cryptography being installed directly into satellites. Defense contractors are already signing deals to bake quantum-resistant encryption into orbital hardware. Because once a satellite is launched, you cannot exactly send a technician up to patch its security software. If the encryption is weak by the time quantum computers mature, that satellite becomes a sitting target for the rest of its operational life. This is why nations are treating quantum readiness in space as a matter of national security, not just scientific curiosity. And it is not only about defense. Timing signals from satellites keep everything synchronized, from power grids to financial markets to military navigation systems. Engineers have already built portable quantum light sources that create tamper-evident links specifically to protect that timing data from jamming and spoofing. Think about that for a second. If someone can spoof the timing signal a satellite sends to Earth, they can throw off navigation systems, disrupt communications, and even mess with the exact timestamps that financial exchanges rely on to record trades in the correct order. Securing that link with quantum technology is not a luxury anymore. It is becoming a requirement. Now here is where the story jumps from orbit straight down to Wall Street. And this is the part that should really get your attention. While physicists were solving uplink problems in labs, investors were quietly piling into quantum computing stocks like never before. In the middle of 2026, quantum-related shares surged even as the broader stock market slumped. On a day when the Nasdaq fell more than 2% and the S&P 500 dropped over 1%, quantum computing companies did the opposite. Their shares climbed, with one major player jumping more than 13% in a single session. That kind of divergence does not happen by accident. It happens when a wave of federal policy support collides with a wave of genuine technical progress at the exact same time. That policy support is not vague either. The United States Department of Commerce set aside roughly $2 billion in quantum funding under the CHIPS and Science Act, with letters of intent signed for 9 different companies. Some of that money is going toward building an actual quantum foundry capable of manufacturing superconducting wafers at scale. Other portions are targeting the unglamorous but absolutely critical engineering bottlenecks, things like cryogenic cooling systems, ultra-fast readout electronics, and reducing photon loss in optical systems. These are the boring sounding problems that actually determine whether quantum computers stay lab experiments or become real infrastructure. Then came 2 executive orders signed in the same month, each one setting hard timelines for federal agencies. One order pushes for a science-enabling quantum computer to be delivered to a Department of Energy facility before the end of the decade. The other order is entirely about cryptographic defense, directing federal agencies to start migrating their most sensitive systems toward quantum-resistant encryption immediately, not eventually. When a government puts hard deadlines behind a technology instead of just talking about it in speeches, investors notice, and money moves fast. That is exactly what has been happening. Some of the leading pure-play quantum companies have posted staggering revenue growth, with year-over-year increases, well, above 500% for the strongest performer, alongside cash reserves in the billions of dollars. Their order backlogs, the contracts already signed but not yet delivered, have grown even faster than their revenue, which tells you something important. It tells you that customers are not just curious about quantum computing anymore, they are actually committing real budgets to it, months and years in advance. But do not mistake this for a sure thing, because that would be irresponsible. And if you have watched this channel before, you know we do not do hype without also giving you the real risk. These companies are still burning enormous amounts of cash every single quarter. Some of them are losing over $100 million a quarter just to keep operating, while their revenue is still measured in the tens of millions. Their stock valuations, when compared to actual sales, are extreme by almost any historical standard, with some trading at price-to-sales ratios that would make even the wildest .com era stocks blush. This is not a sector for someone who cannot stomach watching a position swing 25% in a single month, because that kind of swing has already happened this year, more than once. So why are institutional investors still piling in despite that volatility? Because the underlying physics keeps delivering real milestones, not just promises. One major chip has demonstrated error correction improvements that scientists have been chasing for years, a step that is absolutely essential before quantum computers can run long, complex calculations without the noise destroying the answer. Another company's system reached general availability across multiple major cloud platforms, with 2-qubit gate fidelity above 99%, meaning the individual operations inside the machine are becoming reliable enough to actually trust for real workloads, instead of just laboratory demonstrations. These are the kinds of numbers that separate genuine engineering progress from marketing slides. Meanwhile, the giants of the technology industry are not sitting on the sidelines either. One major cloud provider has published one of the most detailed public roadmaps in the entire industry, aiming to demonstrate a genuine quantum advantage before the end of this year with a large-scale, fault-tolerant system, targeted for the end of the decade. Another giant search and advertising company has drawn massive attention with its own error correction progress, showing that as you add more physical qubits to a system in the right way, the overall error rate can actually go down instead of up, which is the exact opposite of what skeptics have argued for years would happen. And this is where space and finance start to blend together in a way that almost nobody is talking about clearly enough. The same companies racing to build faster, more powerful, accelerated computing hardware for artificial intelligence are now pushing that same compute power into orbit. There are already serious engineering platforms designed specifically to support orbital data centers, giving satellites and autonomous spacecraft the ability to process and fuse sensor data at speeds that were simply unavailable just a few years ago. Once you put serious computing power into orbit, you also open the door to eventually placing quantum sensing and quantum communication. Hardware up there alongside it, creating a genuinely new category of infrastructure that blends space, computing, and finance into one interconnected system. Now let's talk about the part of this story that keeps cryptocurrency holders up at night, because it connects directly back to Wall Street. Analysts have estimated that as much as $470 billion worth of Bitcoin could theoretically be at risk if quantum computing advances far enough to break the cryptographic algorithms protecting those wallets. That number alone should make you sit up, because Bitcoin's entire value proposition rests on the assumption that its cryptography simply cannot be broken by any realistic computer. If a quantum machine eventually crosses that threshold, the entire foundation of digital scarcity that cryptocurrency is built on gets shaken to its core. This is not a distant decades away problem anymore either. It is close enough that blockchain infrastructure companies are already racing to build quantum-resistant layers into their systems today, years before anyone expects an actual quantum computer capable of breaking Bitcoin to exist. One recent partnership specifically built a quantum-resistant blockchain layer to secure tokenized space assets, blending post-quantum cryptography with smart contract technology to protect things like satellite data licenses and even early lunar cargo agreements. Think about how strange that sentence would have sounded just 5 years ago. Now it is simply a business press release. Let's rewind for a second and talk about how we actually got here. because this race did not start in 2026. It started nearly a decade earlier with a single satellite launch that most people completely missed. Back in 2016, one country launched a satellite specifically designed to test whether quantum encrypted information could survive the trip from orbit down to Earth. That mission proved the basic concept worked, and it quietly kicked off a global competition that has been accelerating ever since, mostly out of public view until federal funding turned it into front-page financial news. Since then, that same program has been extended dramatically, with newer microsatellites establishing quantum links stretching well over 10,000 kilometers between continents. Other nations watched this progress closely and responded with their own programs, launching small, lightweight satellites specifically built to prove the same capability using cheaper, more accessible hardware. This is the classic pattern of any strategically important technology. One country proves the concept is possible, and within a few years, a dozen other countries are racing to build their own version before they get left behind entirely. That competitive pressure is a huge part of why we are seeing this sudden explosion of funding and executive action right now. No government wants to be the one still relying on classical encryption, after a rival nation has already deployed a working quantum secured way previous generations treated the race to build nuclear capabilities or the race to reach space itself as a matter of long-term national survival rather than simple technological curiosity. If you're starting to see the pattern here, that's exactly the point of this video. So if this kind of deep dive is useful to you, tap that like button right now before you keep watching, because it genuinely helps this channel keep making these breakdowns. Let's go back to Wall Street for a moment, because the investment story here has quietly split into several very different lanes, and understanding those lanes is the difference between gambling and actually making an informed decision. The first lane is the pure play hardware companies, the ones building actual quantum processors using wildly different physical approaches, some using trapped ions, some using superconducting circuits, some using magnetic annealing, and some using neutral atoms controlled by lasers. Nobody, and I mean nobody, knows for certain which physical approach will ultimately win the race to build a large-scale, commercially useful quantum computer. That uncertainty alone is why serious investors spread their exposure across multiple approaches instead of betting everything on one architecture. The second lane is the big cap technology companies treating quantum computing as one extra weapon in an already massive arsenal. For these giants, quantum is not a make-or-break bet. It is upside layered on top of already dominant cloud, advertising, and enterprise software businesses. They can afford to lose money on quantum research for a decade if it eventually pays off, because their core businesses are generating enormous cash flow regardless of how the quantum bet plays out. The third lane, and this is the one most retail investors completely overlook, is the supply chain underneath all of it. Semiconductor foundries capable of manufacturing the extremely specialized wafers that quantum processors require are receiving massive federal contracts, in some cases larger than the contracts going to the famous quantum brand names themselves. One exchange, traded fund tracking semiconductor and quantum adjacent companies, has posted returns nearly double that of funds holding only the well-known pure play quantum stocks, specifically because federal money tends to flow toward chip foundries and fabrication capacity before it ever reaches the flashy public quantum brands that get all the headlines. The fourth lane is post-quantum security, an entirely separate business built around helping every other company on Earth prepare for a future where today's encryption no longer protects anything. This is arguably the least glamorous but most immediately necessary part of the entire ecosystem, because organizations do not have the luxury of waiting until quantum computers are powerful enough to break their systems before they start migrating to safer encryption. By then, it would already be too late, since encrypted data being stolen today could simply be stored and decrypted years from now once quantum machines catch up. A strategy security researchers openly call harvest now, decrypt later. That fifth phrase, harvest now, decrypt later, deserves its own moment because it explains why this entire race is moving faster than most people realize. Sophisticated attackers do not need a working quantum computer today to make a smart long-term bet. All they need to do is steal encrypted data now and simply wait, storing it until quantum decryption becomes possible, at which point years of stolen secrets suddenly become readable all at once. Government agencies, handling classified information, and financial institutions, handling sensitive transaction data. Both understand this threat model, which is exactly why the executive orders we mentioned earlier are pushing agencies to migrate their most sensitive systems immediately, instead of waiting for quantum computers to actually arrive. There is another piece of this puzzle that rarely makes headlines but matters enormously, and that is quantum sensing. While quantum communication protects information, And quantum computing processes it. Quantum sensing solves a completely different problem, allowing spacecraft and vehicles to navigate accurately even when satellite positioning signals like GPS are jammed, spoofed, or simply unavailable. This matters far more than most people realize, because modern militaries, shipping fleets, and even commercial airlines depend heavily on satellite navigation, and any adversary capable of disrupting that signal could cause chaos across transportation and defense systems simultaneously. Quantum sensors work by measuring incredibly small changes in motion, gravity, and magnetic fields with a level of precision that classical instruments simply cannot match. A vehicle equipped with quantum sensing hardware could theoretically maintain accurate positioning for extended periods without ever needing an external signal at all, essentially carrying its own extremely precise internal compass. That capability becomes especially critical in any scenario where satellite links are deliberately targeted or degraded, which is exactly the kind of scenario defense planners spend enormous amounts of time preparing for. Now let's bring this back to the investor psychology driving all of this, because understanding how markets actually behave around emerging technology is just as important as understanding the technology itself. Every transformative technology sector in modern history has gone through the same emotional cycle, starting with a small group of specialists who understand the underlying science, followed by a wave of speculative capital-chasing headlines rather than fundamentals, followed eventually by a painful shakeout where weaker companies fail and only the strongest survive, with real revenue and real customers. Quantum computing is currently sitting somewhere between the second and third stage of that cycle, which is exactly why volatility has been so extreme. This matters because the companies making real technical progress right now, the ones hitting genuine fidelity milestones, signing genuine long-term contracts, and building genuine cash reserves, are not necessarily the same companies generating the loudest headlines or the biggest single-day stock price jumps. Headlines chase excitement, but disciplined capital chases balance sheets, cash burn rates, and actual signed customer commitments. Learning to tell the difference between a company riding genuine momentum and a company simply riding a wave of sector-wide enthusiasm is arguably the single most valuable skill anyone watching this video can develop right now. It's also worth remembering that government funding, while genuinely significant, tends to favor established players and critical infrastructure providers over flashy consumer-facing brands. The largest single funding commitments in this sector have gone toward foundry capacity and fabrication infrastructure rather than toward the household name quantum computing stocks that dominate financial headlines and social media discussion. That distinction alone explains why some semiconductor-adjacent funds have quietly outperformed the more famous pure-play quantum names, even though almost nobody outside of serious institutional circles is talking about it. Let's zoom back out to space one more time, because there's a fascinating parallel between what is happening up there and what is happening on trading floors down here. Multiple nations have now launched or are actively developing their own quantum satellites, each one testing different pieces of the same overall puzzle. Earlier missions proved that quantum encrypted information could survive the trip from space down to Earth across thousands of kilometers. More recent missions have pushed that distance even further, linking locations on opposite sides of the planet through a single quantum connection. Smaller, lighter microsatellites are now being developed specifically to make this technology cheaper and more accessible, rather than something only a handful of wealthy space agencies can afford to attempt. Why does the weight and cost of these satellites matter so much? Because the entire economics of building a global quantum communication network depends on getting the cost per satellite down low enough that you can actually launch a whole constellation of them, not just one or two expensive prototypes. A single quantum satellite proves a concept works. A network of dozens of them, properly linked together with quantum repeaters extending the range of entanglement across much longer distances, is what actually creates usable infrastructure that governments, banks, and eventually ordinary companies could rely on for genuinely unbreakable communication. And that brings us to quantum repeaters, one of the most underrated pieces of this entire puzzle. Quantum information cannot simply be copied and amplified the way a normal internet signal can, because measuring a quantum particle destroys the very information you are trying to preserve. This is not an engineering limitation that better technology can simply brute force its way past. It is a fundamental law of physics. Quantum repeaters solve this problem in a completely different way by recreating entanglement across shorter segments of a longer path, essentially relaying trust across the network instead of copying data the way classical repeaters do. Getting this technology to work reliably over intercontinental distances is one of the last major engineering hurdles standing between today's isolated demonstrations and an actual global quantum internet. Now, here's a question worth sitting with for a moment. If quantum communication networks eventually connect quantum computers, quantum sensors, and financial systems all together, what does that actually mean for how markets function? Some researchers argue that distributed quantum computing could eventually allow financial institutions to run enormously complex risk calculations across multiple secure locations simultaneously without ever having to centralize sensitive data in one vulnerable place. Instead of shipping all your data to one central processor, you could keep it distributed and secure while still performing the kind of powerful joint calculations that used to require centralization. That is a genuinely different way of thinking about how trading systems, risk models, and even fraud detection could work in the future. Of course, all of this raises a much bigger question that every investor watching this video needs to ask themselves honestly. Is this the early stage of a technology transition, as significant as the early internet? Or is this a speculative bubble inflated by government funding announcements and headline-grabbing partnerships? The honest answer is that it is probably both, at the same time, in different parts of the sector. The underlying physics is real, the federal funding is real, the satellite breakthroughs are real, and the encryption threat is real. But the stock prices of individual companies can absolutely detach from that underlying reality for months at a time, swinging on sentiment, on social media hype, and on short-term trading flows that have nothing to do with actual technical progress. This is exactly why so many experienced voices in this space keep repeating the same warning, that commercial quantum computing at true scale is probably still years away, and possibly longer than optimists want to admit. That warning does not mean the technology is fake or the progress is meaningless. It means the gap between a genuine scientific milestone and an actual profitable, dependable business model can be a long and expensive one to cross, and plenty of companies chasing that gap will not survive long enough to get there. So what should you actually take away from all of this? First, understand that the security foundation underneath satellites, banks, and cryptocurrency is genuinely being tested by the same technology at the same time, which is exactly why this story connects space and Wall Street in a way that feels almost too background noise for this sector. They are actively shaping which companies survive and which ones quietly fade away over the next few years. Third, understand that the investment landscape here is not one single bet. It is at least 4 very different lanes. Hardware companies, big cap giants, supply chain suppliers, and security specialists, each with completely different risk profiles. And fourth, understand that speed matters here in a way it rarely does with other emerging technologies. Because of the harvest, now decrypt later threat, organizations cannot simply wait for quantum computers to mature before reacting. They have to move today, migrating encryption, securing satellites, and rebuilding trust into their systems years before quantum machines are powerful enough to justify that urgency on paper. That mismatch between when the threat becomes real and when organizations must respond to it is exactly why this entire sector is moving faster than almost anyone predicted just a couple of years ago. If you found this breakdown genuinely useful, hit subscribe, because we are going to keep tracking this story as it develops, and there's a lot more coming from New Satellite. Missions being planned right now to upcoming earnings reports that will show whether these companies can actually turn technical milestones into real revenue. Let's talk for a moment about what happens next, because the next 12 months are shaping up to be genuinely pivotal for this entire sector. Several companies have earnings reports scheduled that will directly test whether the recent wave of order bookings and remaining performance obligations translates into durable revenue growth, or whether the sector starts repricing toward a longer, more skeptical commercialization timeline. Watch those earnings dates closely, because a single disappointing quarter from a major player can send shockwaves through every quantum-related stock, even ones with completely unrelated technology and business models, simply because investor sentiment in this sector still moves as a herd. On the satellite side, watch for new missions, specifically designed to test two-way quantum communication links between ground stations in orbit, since proving that uplink works reliably in the real world, not just in a theoretical model, would be one of the single biggest validations this field has seen yet. Watch also for announcements involving smaller, cheaper microsatellites, because those are the vehicles that will actually determine whether a global quantum communication constellation is financially realistic, or whether this remains a demonstration limited to a handful of expensive flagship missions funded entirely by national governments. On the security side, keep an eye on migration deadlines being set by regulators and defense agencies around the world, because those deadlines create forced demand for post-quantum security products, regardless of how quantum computing itself performs as an investment. This is one of the more overlooked parts of the entire story, the fact that you do not actually need a working quantum computer to break encryption in order for post-quantum security to become a massive business. You simply need enough fear, enough regulation, and enough genuine risk to justify organizations spending real budget on protection today. And on the financial side, watch how institutional money continues to rotate between the hardware pure plays, the big cap technology giants, and the semiconductor supply chain feeding all of it. That rotation tells you a lot about where sophisticated investors genuinely believe the real value will accumulate over the coming years, as opposed to where retail attention and headline-grabbing announcements happen to be pointed at any given moment. Public sentiment and smart money do not always move in the same direction, and watching where the gap between the two widens or narrows can tell you more about the health of this sector than any single stock price ever could. Here's the bigger picture worth carrying with you long after this video ends. Quantum computing is no longer confined to university labs and theoretical physics papers. It is now simultaneously reshaping national security policy, satellite engineering, cryptocurrency risk models, and the daily decisions being made on trading floors around the world. Space and Wall Street used to feel like completely separate worlds, one governed by orbital mechanics and the other by quarterly earnings calls. Quantum technology is quietly stitching those two worlds together into a single, interconnected story, and most people have not even noticed it happening yet. The satellites currently orbiting our planet were built for a world where classical encryption was considered unbreakable within any practical time frame. That world is ending, not overnight, but steadily, year by year, milestone by milestone, and the organizations that recognize this shift early are the ones already moving to protect themselves, fund the next generation of hardware, and position their capital accordingly. The organizations that wait, whether they are governments, banks, or individual investors, may eventually find themselves trying to catch up to a race that quietly started years before they realized it had even begun. Think about how quickly this went from a theoretical physics discussion to a front-page financial story, and then ask yourself how many other quiet, unglamorous breakthroughs are happening right now in labs around the world that will feel just as sudden and unavoidable a few years from now. That is really what this story is about underneath all the stock tickers and satellite jargon, the reminder that transformative technology rarely announces itself loudly in advance. It simply accumulates milestone after milestone until one day the world wakes up and realizes everything has already changed. So here is the honest, no hype conclusion. This is not a guaranteed path to riches, and anyone telling you otherwise is selling you something. But it is also not nothing, and treating it as pure hype at this point genuinely ignores the mounting pile of real technical milestones, real federal funding, real satellite breakthroughs, and real revenue growth happening across multiple companies at the same time. The smart move here is not blind excitement, and it is not dismissive skepticism either. It is staying informed, understanding the different lanes of exposure available to you, and recognizing that the story connecting quantum computers, orbiting satellites, and Wall Street trading desks is only getting started. If this video helped you understand what is actually happening beneath all the noise, make sure to like it and subscribe to the channel, because we track stories like this, one closely, and the next 12 months are going to bring developments that could reshape how you think about security, investing, and the technology quietly running underneath everything we depend on every single day.